panel. How's everybody? I think we're live. So I'm going to go under the assumption that we are live and say hello to the panel today and welcome to you and good afternoon to everybody. I'm Andrew Casey with Biotech Canada. I've been tasked with entertaining this panel today, which I'm really looking forward to. I'll get to it because we have an hour. We're tasked with exploring the topic of turning more Canadian biotech medical breakthroughs into successful Canadian companies. And we have today with us to manage this great topic, 4 fantastic panelists. I'm going to try and do this in alphabetical order and see if I've got this right. But Jessica Chutter is here from Morgan Stanley. She's a managing director at Morgan Stanley. Gerald Davis is a managing director at Versant Ventures. And Carl Hansen is the CEO at Accelera, a company you may have heard about in the past couple of months. And Lloyd Siegel, President CEO at Repair Therapeutics, another company that's been in the news in the past year or so. I've introduced you by name and title, but maybe I'll give each of you a moment just to sort of give us a sense, or give the audience a sense as to the voice that you are representing today. So I will stick with the original order there. Jessica, maybe I'll hand it to you for a second.
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As was mentioned, I head up the biotech investment banking practice at Morgan Stanley. We're a global investment bank, and we've been very active in terms of fundraising and strategic activity for biotech companies for the past 3 decades. We've also been very active during this pandemic, actually supported over 16 IPOs, raising $6 billion. And we've had the privilege, and I've personally had the privilege to lead a number of Canadian biotech IPOs, Repair, Fusion, and Clementia. And on the strategic side, we've also been very active working with companies such as AZ in their acquisition of Alexion, Gilead, Immunomedics, and a couple of other very creative partnerships that I think are going to be important for the industry. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hi, Gerald Davis here. Thanks for the invitation to join you all. I'm a managing director with Versant Ventures. Versant is an early stage biotech investor. We do both company creation as well as syndication. In Canada, we've been here over the last number of years, although we're headquartered in the US. We've done 9 companies in Canada, and it's gone very well. 2 of those are public, 4 of those have made their way to liquidity events, and 3 other private companies we're incredibly bullish on. So I think you can say Canada has been a great success for Versant, and we'll continue to do more here.
Great, I'll take it from there. I'm Carl Hansen. I'm the founding CEO of Accelera. My background actually was in the academic path. I had a lab at the University of British Columbia for approximately 15 years where we were working on technologies that combine fields from genomics, computation, microfluidics, single cell analysis, with the broad goal of accelerating and enabling biomedical research. It's from that work that we founded Accelera back in 2012. Accelera was founded not to be a traditional biotech working on the development of products, but rather to be a technology company that supports the industry, working on the development of technology, teams, and capacity to help improve the process of drug development. We built the company up here in Vancouver from the very beginning, recently switched our posture considerably in terms of financing, completed about $800 million in total financing last year, including an IPO at the end of the year.
Man, it's tough to follow, Carl. My name is Lloyd Siegel. I'm the CEO of Repair Therapeutics and a 25-year recovering McKinsey consultant. I had the pleasure of the backing of Versant Ventures and it's incredible ideas and approaches developed by Dan DeRoche and Frank Secchieri at the Lunenfeld, around which we founded Repair Therapeutics. Repair applies a lot of cool ideas Dan developed to look at CRISPR or to apply CRISPR to understand synthetic lethal cancer targets. And this is essentially some advanced genomics that provide insights into how to target one gene product when another gene is mutated out and really precisely target certain tumors. And over 5 years, since 2016, we built the company up. We funded it initially with Versant, ultimately with MPM, and we brought in over a Series B and and then an IPO last June, which Jessica helped lead or led with a bunch of other great banks, where we raised over $230 million. I think our total private capital was another 200 on that, and we're now a public company. Hopefully by the end of the summer, we have one in the clinic and a second entering the clinic sometime this summer.
Thanks, Lloyd. I think it's difficult following Carl. Try being me, and I've got to follow Jessica, Gerald, Carl, and Lloyd. So I'll do my best, though. I think back to just a little over a year ago, the first case of COVID was diagnosed in Canada. We were sort of on the precipice of something that was completely unpredictable in terms of shutting everything down and moving to remote work and all the other things that have happened since then. I think what's been abundantly clear, though, from day one is that this sector is going to be central to getting us out of this mess, whether it be through vaccines, therapeutics, or a combination thereof. And I think that that's been kind of interesting to watch from this perspective. And as a result, it seems to me, and I'm going to put a theory out there and then use the panel to basically dissect it and see if we can come to a conclusion that the theory is somewhat valid. But there's been renewed interest in the sector from an investment perspective. We've seen this sector continue to actually thrive despite the pandemic and lab closures and other things. They've been challenges, but the sector has continued to grow. And I think both Repair and AbCellera are really testament to that fact, and both undertaking your IPOs right in the middle of a pandemic and successfully so. We've seen new investors coming into the space, not the least of which was RBC announcing that they're going to partner with Lumira a couple of weeks ago. So it seems to me that when we think about the future, there's two key parts. One is we have to prepare for future pandemics, viruses, whatever it's going to be, COVID-30, you pick your year, pick your virus. But we're going to have to address that from a healthcare standpoint. But in that, there's an enormous economic opportunity. And when we look at our economy, it's probably going to be either parts of it, they're going to be very slow to recover. And so what can fill that gap? And I look at the biotech sector as one of those key foundational pieces that we can rebuild the economy upon. So meet the healthcare objectives and also the economic rebuild. And the key to doing that, obviously, starts with investment. And then the other piece will be talent. And I think we'll dive into both of those as we talk. So that's my premise. And I want to throw it to all of you. I'm going to start with Jessica and Gerald, because from an investment standpoint, that's kind of where it all begins. And maybe ask you, both have looked at this through the global lens, but also your experience in Canada. You've both highlighted the fact that you've had some success in Canada. So globally, what's the trend right now in investment in biotech? And is that translating to Canada? What are you guys seeing on that front?
Right. Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Look, I've been bullish for 30 years on biotech, but I've never been more bullish than I am today. And it's not just 12 to 18 months, but it's, frankly, for decades to come. I think finally we have a backdrop, and it's shocking that there's a recognition that drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics are actually important for our health. Biotech, pharma was kind of the pariah industry, if you will. And I think now, over the last less than a year, we've really seen the power of foundational platforms in the form of companies like AbCellera and drug discovery in terms of the rapidity of a COVID monoclonal antibody, with Moderna in the context of a vaccine. And I think it really has underscored now what is the investment thesis, and I call it the power of the platform. We are in a time right now where people understand that sequential to sequential drug development makes no sense. You need to have foundational technology so that you can have a breadth of applicability in terms of product platforms, product portfolios. And there's unfortunately way too many things for us to address from a therapeutics and diagnostic side. But I think, unfortunately, we really are seeing now the confluence of science, capital, and people that then can affect the successes here. And I just wanted to, on the capital side, I mean, again, the inflows here are incredible. In 2020 alone, $62 billion was raised, $13.5 billion for IPOs, and $45 billion for follow-ons, which is just as important because it actually means companies can build themselves in the public markets. They're not going to just stop dead after that IPO. But I think also, if we think of the profile in terms of what the CEOs have to build their companies, the IPOs were bigger. They averaged 200 million from a size perspective. They were more highly valued. The average was 500 million pre. They were earlier stage. 2/3 of the IPOs were preclinical or phase 1. And the trading has been incredible as an asset class, up 60%, outperforming, frankly, most indices. The performance has continued to be stellar across the board in terms of performance, whether it's versus the S&P 5. And we talked about some of the Canadian industries. I looked at the 2020 to date performance on the XBI is up 50% compared to down 22% for energy. So I think that underscores the bookends in terms of what the potential is here. And again, perhaps some of the panelists will talk about the new technologies, the new modalities. It's really all coming together. And then the last backdrop, which we can't forget because it keeps investors excited, is strategic activity, again, has been just as robust as the fundraising. Over $100 billion in biotech M&A in 2020 alone, $18 billion plus transactions. And in addition to traditional sell sides, if you will, some very creative structures, Agio selling their oncology business, Bluebird talking about a carve out. And then lastly, we've got some new sources of capital in the form of SPACs. We've got 17 outstanding that have $2.5 billion to deploy. So look, I think that we're in a very important time. Canadian company, this is a global business. The power of the science, whether it sits in Canada or elsewhere, will allow for the capital inflows as we've seen today. And I'm really excited about the prospects. And I hope that in Canada, we'll be able to capitalize on all of this activity.
I'll build on that. Jessica, you've gotten me even more excited about biotech than I was 2 minutes ago. I just want to, I think, echo some of the things Jessica said. First of all, biotech had its best year ever in 2020, and it's the best performing sector. And so maybe we come back in a second to what does that mean for Canada? But if Canada is not going to use whatever gravity it has to attract some of that $62 billion Jessica talked about, there's a huge missed opportunity. And I think if there's nothing we take away from this conversation, I hope it's that, and for policymakers to sort of get that. The second most important thing for me is it's based on fundamentals of innovation. I mean, that's the point Jessica's making. It's not hype. We had the genomics revolution in the late 90s, early 2000s. We generated a lot of information and data that we hope would translate more quickly, but it took a while. And from where we sit, the last 2 decades, we've seen what I call a Cambrian explosion of modalities. The pharmaceutical industry spent over 100 years working on small molecules. Now we have 5, 10 modalities, new next generation small molecules, next generation biologics, gene therapies, cell therapies, new genetic medicines. We have so many things in our arsenal to actually go after the biology that was elucidated in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's just incredible what those modalities can actually do to address pathology, and importantly, translate into clinical outcomes, which is what we're seeing. And some of the value creation has been based on those clinical outcomes. The other point I just echo from Jessica is I think reputationally, there's been a real positive impact. It took COVID to kind of bring biotech innovation into the living rooms for a lot of people. It's amazing. Carl will hate this, but people know the word "bam bam." They know, they talk about the drug that Carl and his team made with their families, with their kids. That's pretty remarkable. So I do think COVID has brought that innovation into the homes and the families of people to understand what the industry can deliver. And again, I just close by saying I really hope Canada can take kind of take a lesson from all this and take advantage of the strengths in Canada to attract that international capital that we're seeing move into the sector.
And Carl and Lloyd, does that reflect your reality? Both of you have undertaken IPOs in this period, and so obviously been out in the marketplace to see how investors have been reacting. What's been your sort of sense of that? And maybe Carl, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of it was already said eloquently by Jessica and Gerald. You know, I would reinforce that there's a huge uplift and watershed moment in biotech in general that is based on fundamental advances in technology. You know, that dates back to things like the Human Genome Project. But if you pull back and look at this from a historical arc, you know, things like PCR are relatively new. We are really in the dawn of molecular biology. So maybe the thing I would add to what's already been said, in addition to the Cambrian explosion of new modalities, is I don't think that people should believe that this is it, that we've arrived and this is the end of it. If you look forward another 30 years, it's very hard to imagine where this is going. And you just have to ask yourself, you know, are we at you know, the flattening of the curve for technology, and have we solved and understood the biological problems that are important to human health? And the answer to both of those is pretty clearly no. So it's a tremendous time in the industry. It's one that's going to play out over many years. That is being recognized, and as you know, as a company that's building technologies, it is very affirming in our IPO process that message, that the technologies, the long-term investments in things that help move the needle in how quickly we can learn and how quickly we can solve these problems are going to be very valuable. And new business models that are not just about making drugs in the short term, but about helping other people to make that process more efficient, were also very well received. So I think our experience, you know, is completely aligned with the comments that we had already from Gerald and Jessica.
So Andrew, in terms of in Canada, I'd venture a guess that 2/3 of the companies that bought Repair at our IPO did not know that we were a Canadian company. And I think that's the best news ever, because they care about the innovation, they care about the technology, they demand to see a team that they can believe can you know, pursue the innovation and execute on a you know, a thoughtful plan to create value and impact for patients. So I think that's the best news ever. I think there used to be a bias against Canadian companies. I remember, you know, in my early years in biotech, I had to remind people molecular biology works the same, you know, north and south of the 49th parallel. The laws of physics don't change, nor the laws of biology. But now, I think you know, Carl and I and the Fusion guys and Ali, there's clear proof that if you've got the technology and the team and a really thoughtful way to innovate forward, you know, the world of capital doesn't care that you happen to be headquartered in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal. And that was, I think, we had a big aha moment, you know, when we had our first meeting on our first public quarter. You know, one of the biggest buyers in the IPO, who hadn't met us before the IPO, asked us, you know, like, you know, are you guys like in Canada? And and you know, it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. It was neither good nor bad news. They did want to know that we met our milestones. That would have been a very different discussion had we not.
There are two pieces of that I want to pick up on and throw back to Jessica and Gerald, because one aspect is, I've heard Jessica and Gerald both say this in two very different forums, is one of the great things about Canada that attracts you to it is just fantastic scientists and to a certain extent the entrepreneurship that's here. So I want to open that bracket up and hear your views from it. But the other side of that coin, Lloyd, is also that I've heard criticism of Canada and Canadian companies is that the companies themselves have thought too small. So while the investors may be agnostic as to where the companies are from, sometimes our own companies are a little bit too short-sighted or not thinking big enough themselves. And so maybe a little bit of perspectives on those two parts of that equation that Lloyd put on the table from Gerald and Jessica. And maybe I'll start with Gerald first.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, Andrew, it's important to take stock. What's been achieved in Canada in biotech over the last 2 to 5 years is pretty staggering given the starting point. So it's important to take stock of that. And then I do think that, just echoing what you said, going forward, we need to play to our strengths. In Canada, I think one of the biggest bottlenecks in any ecosystem, even in the US, is leadership and talent. And I think the generation of leaders we see represented by Carl, by Lloyd, by others, is really promising because they're going to train people, and their trainees are going to train people and create a next generation of really talented leaders and entrepreneurs. And importantly, leaders and entrepreneurs that know what good looks like. It's really hard to be bold when you have no examples. It's a little bit easier when you have, $4 or $5 billion companies created by Canadians on Canadian soil. You know where they live. It makes it a lot more real. And so I hope we can just take advantage of that progress. I also think that Repair and AbCellera and others exemplify some of the scientific areas of strength in Canada. And we heard academics earlier talk about some of those areas. Areas like oncology, areas like biologics, like regenerative medicine, and many, many others. And we should play to those strengths and build on not just the talent, but also the academic talent, not just the industrial talent, but also the academic talent there.
Yeah, I might just add 2 points. I think that when I came back to Canada in the late 90s, the conversations that I did have with the biotech companies, for the most part, I would echo what Gerald had, that they were very small. It was almost like, what's the smallest amount of capital that I can raise to achieve one little small milestone? And my continued questioning would be, how big can the opportunity be? If you, in that context, if you were given $100 million, what would you actually do? And I do think it's the risk mindset, and it's that vision that Gerald just articulated, which I think is absolutely here now. When you have role models, when you have great examples to see what it takes, I think that is very helpful in terms of that mindset. And it's for both the entrepreneurs, but also the investors, because there were a lot of very interesting companies, but the investors wanted to perhaps have an incremental return, and they sold out very quickly. One of the interactions I had was with a company called Allelix, and they had challenges. They sold to NPS. Their product actually was the success of that company, was Sensipar. There are a lot of foundations of early stage Canadian biotech that kind of got engulfed in larger companies that are frankly unknown, but now we're known. And so I think the opportunities are large there. And then I think also that mentality is, and perhaps Carl can comment to this, and Lloyd, that mentality is starting to come into our academic institutions, who are absolutely the best out there. But I think from how do we build our research and, the commercialization aspect, the opportunity of combining industry with academics, I think we've now gotten to a place where we know there's a tremendous amount of benefit that can be mutual benefit that comes from those types of collaborations, which perhaps, historically hadn't been.
And so, Carl, you're now the poster child of all this. You were brave, bold, big, all the things that have sort of befuddled us as a country and to a certain extent some of our companies. What's been that experience for you? And maybe a little reflection. I think Gerald's right on the fact, success will create more success. You look at Vancouver, QLT has a lot of QLT, I'll call them QLT graduates, where they worked at QLT, they've now gone out into space. Lloyd, this is not your first time doing this, so success at your end is also, created more success. So maybe both of you can reflect a little bit on some of what Jessica and Gerald said.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So, I've had the experience of, spanning that entire path right from, starting a technology university, trying to get it started into a company, trying to scale the company, and now taking it and being a public company working on a global scale. So I've seen how this works in our ecosystem. I've also had the opportunity to be at many panels like this, where the question is always asked, what is it we need to do in the country to be better at innovation, at turning discovery into economic opportunity and not just doing the discovery side. The things that you always hear, that I always hear, are people and capital. And my experience has been that both of those are completely wrong. I would say that we have terrific people. We also have people that have potential to be great leaders. And if you look at the successes across the country, we've pretty much got people that stepped up for the first time to lead companies that have been successful. So when you don't have a very well developed pharmaceutical industry and you require that the leadership of your startup company have that kind of experience, well, you're going to come up empty. But that's not been the story of success. So that's the one side. The capital side, I think Lloyd already touched on that. Capital will find great opportunities and it moves easily across borders. It's one of the most elastic things you could have in your economy and in your country. It will seek out good opportunities, and it's up to us to make those happen. The thing that I think is lacking, it's getting better, hopefully, and hopefully our success and Lloyd's and Ali's, infusions is contributing to this, is courage. I think we lack courage and we lack scale in the ideas. And just to maybe underscore that, I can recall in the early days, pitching AbCellera and having people ask us, hey, where could this go and how big could it be? And being a first-time entrepreneur right out of the university with a handful of students getting ready to start this company back in 2012, we were not very ambitious. And so we said, well, look, we think we could build this in 4 years to an exit that could be $100 million exit. And that's what we were displaying and sort of working that out. And we were met with complete disbelief. It was way too ambitious. If you were to take that same pitch and give it in San Francisco, you'd be laughed out of the room because you should be aiming at, this is a global industry. You should be aiming at multi-billion-dollar companies. And if we start from there, right? If we start from the idea that we're going to set out to have this tiny little victory, we will never win, right? In this business, the number one way to fail is you think too small and you're going after a small problem. If you do that, then you can't get people, and then you can't get capital, and then you cannot sustain a business. So the examples of success that we have, these are not small ideas, and Canada can do big things. And now the excuse is gone, and not just in biotech, in tech as well. Look at Shopify. I mean, these are examples of companies that are scaling fast and making an impact. That mindset is the number one thing that is missing from my perspective.
Lloyd, anything on?
It's hard to add to that. I wonder if Carl sees more entrepreneurs, on the West Coast than we see in Quebec. Biotech entrepreneurs, that is. They're hard to find. I'm always on the lookout. At the same time, when I'm in Boston and San Francisco and New Jersey, New York, I meet Toronto and Montreal expats who have decided that that's where they can have a biotech career. I want it to be true that the leaders are all here. I'm not seeing them much, but I think we're getting there. And I think in time, as these companies are successful and have exits, I'm seeing this close up with Clementia now, which sold over a year ago, and now there's a diaspora of former Clementia executives who are showing up in new companies, and it's a virtuous cycle. I just think for guys like us, we're not patient enough to see that play out naturally. I think that there's a role for public policy to play in supporting supporting entrepreneurs. But if I'm really honest, and I know at least I've had this conversation with Jessica before, Canada isn't great at celebrating its entrepreneurs in general. You know, some of you heard me quote, you know, when I moved back to Canada in the 90s, you know, the CBC had just done its 100 greatest Canadians. There wasn't a single entrepreneur, biotech or otherwise, in the list. I don't think there would be today. We don't like or trust our entrepreneurs. And I think we've got to change that somehow. And when I see, again, what, you know, Gerald's point earlier, that it's now dinner table conversation, the innovation that Appcelera is having is changing the lives of people. It's as real as your iPhone, which hasn't been necessarily true. But I'll give you another example that I shared with Andrew, you know, or last week, you know, is, you know, one of the nicest guys, you know, that I've ever met is a minister of state in Canada. He had a terrible bout with cancer. He came back from cancer and is now back in his seat as a minister. And he was the first guy to take a shot at our industry, you know, when there wasn't enough capacity for vaccines in the country. This is a guy who should have been thanking the industry for, you know, the medicines that undoubtedly help him beat cancer. But you can't do that in Canada. Our industry has been vilified. In part, we've earned it, but mostly we haven't. And I think it's something that all Canadians need to think about. I'm not sure how to change it, but I think it you know, it wouldn't be a bad thing for a cabinet minister to say, "This industry saved my life," and I think it's going to save the lives of people who are, you know, who are hospitalized with COVID-19.
The last estimate I heard was that the pandemic has cost the global economy something like $20 trillion, and obviously millions of lives. It'll be interesting to see whether people's impressions and perceptions of the industry changes if it does come to bear that vaccines and therapeutics get us out of this whole mess. So that, I think there's some runway still to be traveled on this one, and we'll see at the end of it whether that's changed. And then just to pick up on something Carl said about the you know, choosing to go bigger, and then tying that into Jessica, you said there's been a shift to greater attention and investment being paid to sort of platforms, and I'm wondering if that's the shift that we're seeing as well, and that's allowed, when I look at, you know, Carl's and Lloyd's companies and seeing what's the success that's out there. Is infusion to be another one? Like, is that what's happening here? And is this something that Canada, to Gerald's point, should be really building on in terms of our foundational base?
Well, look, I think that, you know, again, the focus on platform is one that comes from, you know, capital availability, and also, I think, an appreciation of timelines and what that bolus of activity that may take, you know, 5 or 6 years, what the outcome will come from that. And the fact that you can have a broad portfolio, the fact that you don't have to partner out your products, the fact that you're not facing patent cliffs on a sequential basis. And so I think that we fundamentally have a lot of very good examples of one's ability then to generate your own pipeline from the platform that's been produced. And I think what we're seeing is that this is occurring at a faster and faster pace, because some of that technology has been sitting within universities and hospitals. And now, with the collaboration that's occurring with industry, one's been able to capitalize that and then you know, bring it out in terms of you know, aggressive development, et cetera. Yeah. So it's really been a very successful model. And the previous model of partnering out and getting capital through that means has really been put aside. I mean, frankly, the largest transactions that occurred in the early days of biotech, Genentech, Roche, Genetics Institute, American Home, those were all driven by capital needs, not by technology needs, not by people needs. It was all capital. So now that capital is available, and you have investors that are intelligent and recognize what the opportunity is, I think that allows for that changing business model.
Yeah, and I'll add that on top of everything that Jessica said, which I agree with 1,000%, from an investor perspective, and I'm talking about the biggest, you know, when you engage with the Fidelities of the world, they view platforms and the prolific nature of platforms to deliver into your pipeline of things that you're going to do as risk mitigation, because we're in a business where more things fail late than succeed. And so the idea that it's not an accident, while everybody talked about an exciting program that Carl and AbCellera developed with Eli Lilly, it was not lost on any of their big investors, I'm certain, that there was 100 other things going on. And if 3 of those succeed in a very big way globally as global products, it more than justifies the current valuation, let alone the upside. And for us, we had a very similar experience in our engagement with investors who, we actually completed a partnership with BMS, for 65 million upfront US. And it was because the wide end of our funnel, the very earliest targets that we identified, there were more than we could possibly prosecute in the next 3 years. And given that it was inevitable that other people would discover these things that we had already identified, we wanted to make sure that that we had an economic interest and that those projects were being pursued. But it wasn't, we weren't selling our adult children, right? These were, embryonic frozen sperm, or I don't know, there's some good analogy here, right? But it was the era you're referring to, you had to sell your firstborn child. And I think that's a sign of the maturation of Canadian companies. They're doing that less and less.
Can I just add a point? It's a little bit nuanced, and I'll try to get it across. The calculus that used to be done in biotech was that value correlates heavily with asset stage, because you have this attrition from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. We don't really know what causes it. It's multifactorial. The likelihood something that enters the clinic makes it to approval is between 8 and 12%, and so it's a shots on goal game. That calculus is being really rewritten, because we understand biology so much more that the likelihood of success is so much higher into phase 3 and approval. And that early on, even preclinically in phase 1. And so even if you look at Repair's approach, we're taking a patient-first approach. We know their mutation, we know their lesion, we think we're developing drugs that actually target that specific patient population. You could not do that in the past. An oncology agent in the 1990s, it was just a coin toss. You don't know who it's going to work in. So I think that even the sophisticated long-only investors get that value can now be recognized preclinically and very early on, because the biology is understood to the extent that you really think these things are going to work. So it's a concern. You look at all the preclinical companies going public, and you wonder if you should worry. But I do think the calculus is different. I think investors recognize that as well.
And did that calculus sort of shift a little bit? We talked a bit about strengths, the sort of new age of AI or computational drug discovery, whatever terms you choose to use. Is that what's facilitating that transition, or is there something else at play here?
I can take a crack at that one. I think there's obviously a lot of attention on AI, and it's clearly a powerful technology. I do think that it's only one piece of what is driving this, and what that actually brings to the table is, if you can generate large amounts of data, if you are organized to maintain the quality of that and to see the relationships, then you can apply artificial intelligence or computational tools in general to extract information that you otherwise could not. And that's a very important piece of it, but it is not the case that AI is the magic bullet and that you're going to take a problem, bring it into your computer and come up with a solution in silico that is for sure going to work. I hope that's the case in the future, but that's not where we are today. So I think AI is one piece, but really what is probably more powerful is all of these technologies that have come in line or online over the last 10 years. And you think about, genomics, you think computation, you think, CRISPR and editing, single cell analysis, microfluidics. All of these things are relatively new. And from the perspective of the industry, they have happened only yesterday. And so there is a realization that this has unlocked new opportunities, and as you unlock them, a lot of these things generate data, and the computational side, is required to really unlock the power of that in the long run.
Okay, I'm just going to shift gears slightly here. We have now Accelera, Repair, Aurinia just got FDA. There's Fusion, a number of good examples of companies that have sort of really moved quite nicely along the continuum here, and are on the precipice of just going to that next phase. So there's a lot of growth that's still to come. But I think we're pretty good as a country at creating a lot of new companies. We're doing a better job at creating the sort of higher value companies. But I think one of the areas that we're really struggling with is to sort of take that group of companies and get it across the finish line and have Canadian companies that are globally competitive and really be based here in Canada. I think that's really critical in terms of that success will create more success concept. So as I think about Repair and Accelera and the other ones, what do we need to do to ensure that we're supporting your growth and ability to sort of stay here? What things are getting in the way of that, and what things do we need to put in place to actually to sort of bridge that gap? So I'll start, Carl. You're sort of there. What do you see from that vantage point?
It's a great question. The two that come to mind right away. So one of the things that's true in Vancouver, I assume it's true in most, if not all geographies in Canada, is if you are building a company that requires a large headcount, which we are doing. So over the next few years, we intend to add maybe 1,000 employees here in Vancouver. There's no lab space in Vancouver. We haven't had the industry, and we haven't had the private sector that's moved in and started to build the labs and the infrastructure. So a company like ours needs to be thinking 3 years ahead of time and literally contributing to the bricks and mortar and the build out. So that is friction that exists in our system that is not present in some of the big centers in the US. In San Francisco, everyone is building lab space. There's construction all the way along the Bay, and you can assume that by the time you get to that space, you will be able to find somewhere to move the company. I would just sort of add to that's perhaps an opportunity as we come out of COVID recovery. Shovel-ready projects and infrastructure immediately create jobs, and they create facilities that help us to build the knowledge economy. And those end up being sticky jobs because there's facilities that are attached to those FTE counts. The other one that's really, I didn't notice early on, but it's something that we're definitely becoming aware of is policy decisions. I think one of the things that the government can do that has immense impact is to create an environment that makes Canada competitive for business relative to other places. One of those things that we recently encountered, as you're a public company, you engage with a variety of different, tax advisors, and you get advice on how to optimize your economics so that you can reinvest for growth. And the advice that we get from everyone is that we need to find ways to move our intellectual property out of Canada and move it into jurisdictions that have more favorable tax treatment. So, for instance, there are many countries in Europe that have patent box systems that create, the effective tax on IP that is, anywhere from half to less than that of what we pay here in Canada. So if as a Canadian that built a technology here that is starting a company that is fiercely patriotic, to have a professional tell you need to move your IP out of Canada seems very counterproductive. And I think that's something that we should change. It's probably not the only policy, but it's important that we have that we recognize that biotech and investing is a global business, and we have a competitive environment to attract capital, attract people, and attract businesses.
Yeah, I think those are two great points. I'd add that, and the government, I have to give them credit where it's due, is already pre-COVID started to make this easier than it ever was, but there's still a long way to go. And that is immigration and related things. When we want to bring great global employees, it's not just about bringing Americans to the US, they're great European, even African, Asian, PhDs, postdocs, specialists that we want to bring in. And it was historically very difficult. In Quebec, there's another layer of difficulty. And this is truly a global business. So, you can recruit globally. I think there's a new appreciation that Canada is a great place to live. But we should be viewed as strategic enough that, if you got an employee, and this is sort of real life example, Cambridge, PhD, EU citizen, it should be nothing to get that person to move to Quebec. It should be the easiest thing in the world based on the taxes they'll pay on the income they're going to earn and the residents they'll have in the local and Canadian economy. And I think that's it should be an easy policy ask, although I recognize there's a provincial dimension to this.
Clearly, we don't have to worry about weather anymore because it looks like Texas is getting the weather that Quebec normally gets.
Yeah, but I can't let this go without mentioning tax, right? And it's not just about IP. Austin is eating, Silicon Valley's lunch these days. All you got to do is follow, what's his name, Elon Musk's Twitter to know what the latest trend is, right? And California is now higher taxed than both corporately and individually than most of Canada. We can attract people, and I don't want to pretend for a second that that's the only thing that drives employees, but it is a thing. It's a real thing, and Canadians don't like to talk out loud about it, but it's part of the equation. And I think policy change can help that because I think I don't know about Carl, but I know other companies like Xenon and us. I have half my leadership team in Kendall Square, and that's an incredibly competitive and unfriendly place to do business. But Andrew, you and I have talked about it, right? It's the safest place for a biotech leader to have a job because if she, if her company gets sold, she doesn't have to change her parking spot. And there's something to that. We can create those kind of clusters here, but we need a little bit of help, not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because people are obviously, they can move anywhere they want to go, but investment's not really dissimilar, right? The investors are traveling the world. They're looking for the most hospitable places to invest money where they get the greatest returns, and there's a safety element to it. So from an investment standpoint, when you look at Canada and the hosting conditions, which is what I sort of referred to that encompasses all of this that Lloyd and Carl talked about, what's the perspective from international investors in terms of Canada as a place to host investors and grow companies? Is it something we need to work on, or are we doing pretty well? Some thoughts there from Jessica and Gerald.
Well, I think interestingly enough, again, in terms of COVID, with frankly people not having the physical needs to be at their, I mean, there's a lot of investors who actually do have geographic constraints. I mean, they're self-imposed, but they don't want to go further than 100-kilometer radius or something like that. And I actually think that, from an employment standpoint, in terms of mobility, from an investor standpoint, in terms of the mobility of that capital, I think that we've actually taken away quite a few of the barriers that had been there, whether they were real or unreal, in terms of how people were thinking about investments. Now, Gerald, you might, because I don't have all the specifics in terms of the technicals, but I had heard feedback in the days that it was not as easy to make investments in Canada, that there were certain barriers in place that, in terms of the ease of investment was a little bit more challenging. And so people, they didn't have to lean in. People had lots of opportunities, right at their own doorsteps.
Yeah, we haven't seen much of that. I mean, I think in the early days, there were a couple questions on you can't take completely the NVCA legal documents. There's some changes you have to make. So there's some things that are new and different, but there really are no barriers. I think from the Versant point of view as a U.S. firm, I do have the sense that a number of years ago, investing in a Canadian company was just different. So it was the unknown, and it was an ecosystem in an ecosystem that was underdeveloped. And there was a sense from people that may not be as familiar with Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, for examples, that maybe I'm investing in an ecosystem that's not developed. They won't be able to find the talent. They won't be able to scale.
Yeah.
I think that's changed. I think we're talking about some names that have shown that you can do it, and now Canada has an opportunity. All Canadian companies have an opportunity to be kind of like the hidden gem that investors should want to invest in next. And you see groups like OrbiMed that invest a lot in US, Asia, Europe, that are probably in 5 or 6 or 7 Canadian names. So I think more than ever, Canada is now maybe in a more attractive place that should attract biotech investors' attention rather than the opposite, which I think is probably the case 10 years ago.
Right, and Gerald, you've said it years. I've heard you say it many times that this was a quiet, hidden place that you could come here, and there was all sorts of fantastic science and great innovation that you felt, at least from Versant, you had a competitive advantage to find that stuff. Is it a more competitive space for you as investors now in Canada, where you're going to have to get the elbows up a little bit more to find those companies and keep them in your folds?
I think we're so undersaturated. I mean, Lloyd always has the comment, you can, in Cambridge, you can change companies without changing parking lots. That's over here. We're way over here. So we got a long way to go before we get to that point.
I do think, Andrew, one area of focus that is worth thinking about from a policy perspective for Canada is getting our own large pension and other large funds to make even a normal allocation to biotech. It's I've been in this industry long enough to know that most of them had their fingers badly singed in the late 90s and early 2000s on companies that probably shouldn't have been public and shouldn't have been raising institutional money. But now, you can't, as to Jessica's very earliest point today, you can't be any kind of fund, no matter what your benchmark is, and have met that benchmark if it's a broad fund. I'm talking about a Case Depot sized fund, if you don't have a biotech allocation, because biotech drove the Russell 2000, the larger Russell, the NASDAQ index, the S&P was in part driven by biotech. So it'd be great to see the Canadian institutions step up and for them to have encouragement from both federal governments and provincial governments. I mean, it's just been basically FTQ in the case.
And maybe the RBC Lumira connection is sort of a starting point, and I think with CPP is into fusion. Is that not the case? So
yeah. Drip.
Okay, well, gotta start somewhere, right, Lloyd?
I mean, it's great, and it made great headlines for a day. But I love RBC, but RBC is not. I'm talking about OMERS and teachers and CPPIB. That they make I don't know, Jessica. Typically, a U.S. fund like CalPERS will have something like 1.5, 2 points allocated to biotech and another point to healthcare, right?
Yeah.
That's billions of dollars into the and so they're putting the money into the funds that then invest in the U.S. companies and invest in Gerald, and it's the the large endowments, the huge family offices, they all, in the US, they all have a biotech allocation. And that flows through to the capitalization of an industry that we don't have domestically here.
Another area maybe where success will create more success or more interest. One last area I want to explore with you, and I think would be remiss, because if I think of the audience for the panel, and if I understand the history of Accelera and Repair, Accelera is out of UBC, Repair out of U of T. So our universities are creating obviously some great companies, but is this an area that we need to get better at, and then sort of the transfer component? I know, Gerald, you've had an interest in, can we be better at this part? So maybe a bit about the success that we've had from Lloyd and Carl, but then also from an investment standpoint, where do we need to get better at in terms of generating more companies or commercial companies out of the universities?
Sure, I can I can start that. Our experience, I'd say, is that the university was a very valuable ally to Appcelera from the go, and I think that is an advantage in Canada. I think the dynamic for professors that are starting companies out of universities, there's more support. In part, that's a reaction to the fact that we have a much less developed ecosystem. So if you try to throw a technology over the fence, there's no one to catch it. So it needs to incubate at the university. And that was definitely important. I think we've got a long way to go in terms of taking the really good science and the really good ideas and effectively booting up companies from the university. There are efforts ongoing, not just in biotech, but across all of entrepreneurship. If I were to be, I think those are good initiatives. I think they're largely educational. If I was to be a little bit, critical of that effort, it's that it's a little bit too formulaic, and that's not really how companies work. That every company is a unique opportunity. Every company requires, different strategies for financing, different business strategies, different people. And if you try to can that, you're almost always giving bad advice to someone. So it's much more idiosyncratic. And I think the best thing you could do is have the examples, have the mentors, and encourage people to dismiss the small ideas early so they're not wasting their time on the little stuff and we're focusing on the big things.
Yeah, I actually think this is an opportunity for Canada to lead the world. Let's think about it for a second, right? We have a concentration of research-based universities that very few other countries have. We're like Israel, right? And every one of those universities is state-sponsored. So there's not like these private universities, it's not like, Harvard and their endowment and Stanford and its endowment, and they make their own rules and laws. Every single one of these institutions are dependent on principally their provincial and largely the federal government. I think real policy change that give our institutions an advantage would be to come up with a world-beating model to transfer technologies, great techs, to support them, to identify them and surface them, patent the right ones, and get them into the hands of Lumira and Versant and Orbimed and whoever else very quickly. And I think that's a way we could be world-beating. You talk about big ideas and ambitious. It involves a lot of provincial policy along with federal policy, but one thing the US learned is, they can use federal grants to make rules that apply on technology and IP coming out of universities, effectively forcing universities to license them. Right now, I think we had an amazing experience with the Lunenfeld. The people there are fantastic, but I think that there's a rule in Canada that's not dissimilar to most institutes in the US, where the fact that a company is coming in with capital to license it, well then it must be good. The price just got higher. And you want to have that kind of, I think the government in every province and the federal government should support really, really qualified, almost VC-like people in their technology transfer offices who can understand the value of the assets and where they belong. And this would be great inside Pfizer, but this belongs this is a platform and a company, and it's a key inflection point for technologies coming out of Canada that could result in, hey, when Gerald gets the call from this university, this is something I got to go look at.
Yeah, we have experience working around the globe. I mean, and when I say around the globe, largely the US, Canada, and Europe. So we see a lot of different tech transfer offices. And I think fundamentally, one of the biggest value add things they can do is just remove barriers to getting things out of the university, getting sponsored research done, get it done quickly, because time is of the essence. There's 3 other academics in different parts of the world that have similar discoveries. And if they hold you up, you're going to get behind. So there is that's kind of, it sounds like table stakes, but it's actually hard to do, to have the university get out of its own way to help enable something. I think the second thing, and I worry a little bit about the tech transfer offices creating business plans and having people in there that are going to do that, because I think it's very hard to attract the kind of talent to do that. And I agree with what Carl said. There's no a box checking exercise that will get you to a startup. It's highly, highly opportunistic, and every situation is different. The tech transfer offices we've seen that are the most effective are the ones that have moved away from the old way that the offices have generated a value around IP, like the Kabili patents we all think about with Genentech and the Wharf patents that have generated so much money. A lot of offices get infatuated with that, and they think it's based on IP that they're going to create value. And they've turned their model to be more like Jerry Maguire. And they have people in their office who are all going out and trying to find their Cuba Gooding Jr. And I can't remember what his name is in the movie. And they're going to go market that person. And they're going to make sure that their favorite VCs know that this person's doing something incredible, has some bullet ideas. They introduce them to all the best VCs or angels or bankers or whoever is the right call point. And they get them in front of people and they say, hey guys, just talk. And we're going to take some equity we know at the end of the day, and we're going to create value that way by making that connection. So I don't know how, I haven't found it. There's a couple tech transfer offices where it's usually individuals in those offices that are just about making those connections and playing the kind of Tom Cruise role of marketing their key academics. But for me, that's the biggest value that those offices, just focusing on the tech transfer offices, that they can play, in the Versant experience.
Great advice. Maybe we go with the Jerry Maguire that said, you had me at Canadian Biotech is great, or whatever the way of contorting that quote would be. I think we're at the end of our session, so I will say thank you, Jessica, Gerald, Carl, and Lloyd. Really fantastic thoughts and some stuff to go away with. I think my premise that Canadian biotech industry is in great shape. Investment is flowing globally and into Canada. It's intact as a premise, so I'm going to go with it, which may be a dangerous thing, but I think it does make sense to me. And there are some things we can build on. So thank you for all those great thoughts. Really appreciate the time today, and I'm going to pass it back over to Shanna. Thank you, Shanna.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. Great panel. Thank you to all of you for participating. Amazing discussion, lots of ground covered, and very memorable comments, and incredibly inspirational too about where this is going and how we as a community can continue to make impact. So I thank you all so much for your time and your insights. I thank our first round of speakers for their time as well. Great presentations. And last of all, I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I hope you got some value out of spending the afternoon with us. This is being recorded. We'll post it. Feel free to pass the link to this event along, because I think there were a lot of really important messages that were covered off today. So again, thanks everybody. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you soon.